It is a common trope in literature that the only weakness to a threatening adversary is itself. This cliché is exemplified particularly often in movies and video games where the characters are depicted as struggling for the advantage in a fight until the discovery is made that the enemy takes damage in some capacity from its own arsenal. The realization of the tactic then demonstrates the tilt in the balance of power expressed within the mise-en-scène. But in what regard would this be characterized through a multiplayer lens? This is the Parafox, and here I will explore the symbolic nature of Genji Shimada's deflect ability in the 2016 multiplayer game Overwatch, as well as how the nature of this ability manifests in the diegesis. The potency of such an ability relies upon that which exists as an offensive medium outside of the self, barring the instance of a mirror character selection, which, truly, remains outside the self regardless, but more on this in a moment. The accumulation of enemy attacks are primarily divided into two categories, projectile and hit scan, between which no dichotomy is created through contact with the deflect. It is only a third category of attack, which might be termed beam or channeling, that transcends the pure physicality of the ability. The ability then acts as a tangible construct rendered obsolete against the diegetically evolving medium of firepower. Yet despite the aesthetic contrast, the ability remains nurtured in its situational efficacy, as the nature of evolution dictates that change occurs over time, and as of yet the striking majority of firepower exists in such a dichotomy of projectile versus hit scan, as the technologies surrounding the aforementioned channeling attacks manifest themselves in their infancy with regards to range. Another topic the deflect ability brings to light is that of the self in relation to the diegetic world and the mechanical world. A primitive reading of the deflect is one of intrinsic arrogance, defined in two key patterns. The first is that of protection of the self, the primal survival instinct of man. The player activates the ability in the literal face of adversity as a means to sublimate the force of firepower directed towards Genji. For without the self, there is no window to the world, as there is no expression of the ego. The second pattern is in the assumption of status. When the player activates the ability, it is with the twofold presumption that oppressive firepower will first be directed his way, which reflects the second presumption of his being significant enough in the eyes of the opponent to merit the priority in his demise. Thus, the very action of activating the deflect indicates an indirect and subconscious exhibition of the ego. As mentioned earlier, the deflect relies on offensive mediums excluding channeling attacks that originate outside of the self. One might raise the objection that in the instance that a Genji is selected on the opposing team, the attack then originates from the same character, and thus is not outside the self. However, in this instance, while the same character is selected, each version of the character is controlled individually, which reinforces the identity of the player captured within the limitations of the game actions, that is, the control scheme, on each side. A further objection might be raised in that if an enemy were to select Genji, that he could use the deflect to counter the player's action of the shuriken or fan of blades, and that thus the origin of the offensive medium is the player's own Genji. This, however, is a false attribution of origin. Of course, the individual shuriken, here being used in the plural, are thrown from the player's Genji, but past that point exist in a state whereby contact only inflicts damage towards the opposing team and never the allied team, including that player's Genji. The act of a deflect from an opposing Genji transforms those shuriken into projectiles originating now as shuriken on the enemy Genji's team, effectively creating a new attack. Therefore, the self of Genji, in contrast to all other heroes in the Overwatch roster, is immune to himself. To build off of the case brought up by the second hypothetical objection then, the deflect is first and foremost a deconstruction of the firepower directed towards Genji. Once that firepower is created and directed at him, he then possesses not only the capability to return such an offense to his attacker, he has the option to redirect it to any of the attacker's allies as well. This situation creates a sharp contrast to the earlier exploration of the ego in relation to the assumption of being targeted. For once Genji has come into contact with such firepower that stands to be redirected, the perceived arrogance of the assault is then metamorphosed into a calculated premeditation. As a result, we have an illustration of an intangible quantum superposition. Genji is granted a state of Schrödinger's arrogance. Until he is fired upon within the duration of the deflect, he is perceived as both arrogant and premeditative. Compared with the scale to which the myriad depictions of hostile forces bearing the tools to their own demise exist in the literary canon, here defining written work, film, and digital games as literature, as well they should be, Genji's deflect reflects a disconnect between the aspect of duration and direct power. In this respect, the player of Genji must expect an intersect of weapon fire with which to redirect at a select subject, and introspectively suspect and subsequently detect a foe's attempt to misdirect, because if he is incorrect and has no circumspect protection, he will be, simply put, wrecked. Thank you for watching, and please let me know in the comments which ability you'd like to see me critique next.